When Americans turned on their TVs in the early 1990s, one contentious issue was hard to miss: immigration. Is immigration good for America? The federal government won't stop them at the border. You spend $5.5 billion a year to support them. There's a right way. And there's a wrong way. In the early 1990s, the United States found itself at a crossroads, grappling with a rising tide of approximately 5 million undocumented immigrants. During this period, a significant portion of the American population harbored deep concerns about the impact of immigration on various facets of the nation. Many Americans perceived immigrants as a burden, attributing the strain on job opportunities, housing availability, and healthcare resources to this demographic. The prevailing sentiment was one of skepticism, where a considerable portion of the public believed that the overall level of immigration needed to be curtailed for the sake of the nation's well-being. This sentiment was often articulated through a metaphorical lens, with some describing the influx of immigrants as akin to an invasion. The comparison to cancer cells underscored the perception that the undocumented population was perceived as a threat to the overall health and stability of the country. This characterization reflected a prevailing narrative that painted immigrants as a detriment rather than a potential asset to the nation. As a result, these perceptions set the stage for a significant shift in the political landscape, where calls for tougher immigration measures gained traction, shaping the subsequent policy decisions and legislative actions that unfolded in the years to come. Political shift. In the aftermath of the public's growing concerns about immigration in the early 1990s, a seismic political shift occurred as Republicans capitalized on the sentiment by incorporating a tough-on-immigration platform into their political agenda. This strategic move proved highly effective, culminating in the Republican Party seizing control of Congress. The electoral success of the Republicans exerted significant pressure on Democrats to respond and adapt to the prevailing narrative. Facing a political landscape that prioritized stringent immigration measures, Democrats found themselves compelled to adjust their stance on immigration policy. Despite traditionally championing the idea of the United States as a nation built by immigrants, Democrats, too, adopted a more robust and restrictive approach. The rhetoric during this period often emphasized the dual nature of the United States, not only as a nation with a rich history of immigration but also as a nation governed by laws that needed to be upheld. This political shift marked a departure from earlier narratives that celebrated the nation's immigrant roots. Instead, it reflected the broader changes in public opinion and the political climate, where addressing immigration concerns became a focal point for both major political parties. The assertion that the United States is a nation of laws underscored the necessity, as perceived by the political leadership of the time, to establish and enforce immigration policies that aligned with the legal framework governing the nation. The turning point. The pivotal moment in reshaping the landscape of immigration policies came in 1996 when President Bill Clinton signed into law a landmark piece of legislation known as the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, or Fura. At its core, the legislation was crafted with the ambitious aim of curbing the number of undocumented immigrants residing in the United States. However, as events unfolded, it became evident that the actual impact of the law would be diametrically opposed to its intended goal. Fura, rather than achieving a reduction in the population of undocumented immigrants, set in motion a series of changes that significantly altered the dynamics of immigration in the country. The repercussions of the legislation were profound and far-reaching, ushering in an era of heightened scrutiny and increased challenges for those navigating the complex landscape of immigration. The signing of Fura marked a turning point that ushered in a new era of immigration policies characterized by increased stringency and a departure from previous approaches. The repercussions of this legislative shift would reverberate through the subsequent decades, shaping the experiences of immigrants and influencing the broader discourse on immigration within the United States. Before 1990s immigration. Before the 1990s, the landscape of undocumented immigration in the United States bore stark differences compared to the contemporary scenario. The nature of immigration during this period was predominantly characterized by its temporariness. Individuals engaged in seasonal work would traverse the border, moving back and forth in pursuit of employment opportunities tied to specific times of the year. The concept of temporary migration was a defining feature, as people ventured northward for seasonal work, particularly during harvest periods. The cyclical nature of this migration allowed for a flow that mirrored the demands of the labor market, with individuals returning to their home countries after completing their work commitments. Legal channels for permanent settlement were limited, and those who sought to establish permanent residency faced a constrained set of options. Marriage to an American citizen, sponsorship by a sibling who was already a citizen, or employer sponsorship were among the few available pathways. Importantly, these avenues were not easily accessible, and individuals often found themselves in undocumented status before seeking legal pathways. The threat of deportation during this period was relatively low, primarily reserved for individuals involved in major criminal activities such as murder or trafficking. The deportation process was less pervasive, and the criteria for removal were confined to serious offenses. The dynamics of immigration before the 1990s reflected a more fluid and temporary movement of individuals, with legal pathways limited but deportation risks comparatively restrained. This era represented a distinct chapter in the history of immigration, setting the stage for the transformative changes that would follow with the enactment of legislative measures like Fura in 1996. Impact of Fura. The repercussions of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, Fura, were far-reaching, ushering in a new era in the realm of immigration enforcement. Enacted in 1996, Fura brought about significant changes, particularly in the expansion of deportable offenses. Under Fura, the scope of deportable crimes underwent a drastic expansion, encompassing even minor infractions that were previously not considered grounds for deportation. This marked a departure from the earlier practice where individuals were typically deported for major criminal activities such as murder or trafficking. The shift towards including minor offenses in the list of deportable crimes resulted in a more automatic and widespread deportation process. Moreover, Fura introduced a retroactive dimension to deportation proceedings. Unlike the previous system, where deportation decisions were often based on an individual's current circumstances, the new legislation allowed for the consideration of past actions. For instance, even a minor misdemeanor committed years before could become a basis for deportation under the retroactive provisions of Fura. The legislation also laid the groundwork for subsequent laws and policies related to immigration enforcement. It established a framework that not only increased the reasons for which individuals could be deported but also facilitated a more streamlined and less discretionary deportation process. One of the most notable aspects introduced by Fura is the implementation of the 3- and 10-year bars. These bars erected substantial barriers for individuals seeking legal pathways to regularize their immigration status. The mechanism worked in a way that individuals who had been residing in the U.S. without legal status for 6 months or more were required to leave the country and faced a 3-year bar on their return. For those with an undocumented presence exceeding 1 year, the bar extended to a daunting 10 years. These stringent provisions had profound implications, making the pursuit of legal status through various channels an arduous and, in many cases, unattainable task. The 3- and 10-year bars essentially created a punitive system that deterred individuals from attempting to regularize their immigration status through lawful means. The unintended consequence was a significant increase in the number of people choosing to remain in the U.S. without legal documentation, contributing to the growth of the undocumented population over subsequent years. 3- and 10-year bars. The implementation of the 3- and 10-year bars introduced by the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, Fura, had profound implications for individuals seeking to regularize their immigration status in the United States. These bars, characterized by their strict and inflexible nature, significantly altered the landscape of immigration policies. Under these provisions, individuals who had been residing in the U.S. without legal documentation for a period exceeding 6 months were subject to a mandatory requirement: they had to leave the country. However, the consequences extended beyond mere departure. Upon leaving, they faced a daunting 3-year bar on their return to the United States. This meant that individuals, even if eligible for legal status through certain channels, were effectively barred from re-entering the country for a specified period. The severity of these bars increased exponentially for those who had been undocumented for more than a year. In such cases, individuals were confronted with a staggering 10-year bar, further limiting their ability to return to the U.S. legally. This uncompromising approach created significant obstacles for individuals seeking lawful pathways to regularize their immigration status. One of the notable consequences of the 3- and 10-year bars was a form of family separation by another name. Families, often with mixed immigration statuses, found themselves grappling with the harsh reality of prolonged separations. If a family member, even one with established ties or potential eligibility for legal status, triggered these bars, the separation became a de facto outcome of the immigration policies. Moreover, the implementation of these bars had unintended consequences. Rather than serving as an effective deterrent, the punitive nature of the bars incentivized individuals to remain in the U.S. without legal documentation. The prospect of facing extended bars acted as a disincentive for individuals to voluntarily leave the country, contributing to the growth of the undocumented population over time. In essence, the 3- and 10-year bars, conceived as measures to dissuade undocumented immigration, ended up fostering conditions that encouraged individuals to stay in the U.S. without legal status. The rigid application of these bars underscored the complexities and unintended outcomes associated with immigration policies that prioritize punitive measures over comprehensive and compassionate solutions. Unintended consequences. The passage of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, Fura, in 1996 marked a significant turning point in the dynamics of undocumented immigration, particularly for Mexican immigrants. The implementation of Fura inadvertently triggered a series of unintended consequences that reshaped the patterns of migration and contributed to the persistent growth of the undocumented population. Prior to Fura, the landscape of undocumented immigration, especially for Mexican immigrants, was characterized by a certain level of transience. Approximately 50% of Mexican immigrants who found themselves in the U.S. without legal documentation were likely to return to Mexico within a year. This pattern reflected the historical practice of individuals moving back and forth across the border, often engaging in seasonal work and maintaining familial ties on both sides. However, the enforcement measures introduced by Fura disrupted this established pattern. Rather than acting as a deterrent to undocumented immigration, the legislation inadvertently incentivized individuals to remain in the U.S. once the 3- and 10-year bars were implemented. The prospect of facing extended bans on re-entry became a significant factor influencing the decisions of undocumented immigrants. The consequences of this shift became evident in the post-Fura era. Contrary to the legislative intent of decreasing the number of undocumented immigrants, more individuals chose to stay in the U.S. despite the punitive measures aimed at dissuading unauthorized residency. The unintended result was a rise in the population of undocumented immigrants. Before Fura, estimates placed the number of undocumented immigrants at around 5 million. However, in the aftermath of the legislation, this figure experienced a substantial and sustained increase. Today, the undocumented immigrant population is conservatively estimated to be at least double the pre-Fura numbers, highlighting the enduring impact of the legislation on migration patterns. The unintended consequences of Fura underscore the complexity of immigration policymaking and the need for a nuanced understanding of how legislative actions can produce outcomes contrary to their intended goals. In this case, what was meant to curtail undocumented immigration ended up contributing to the growth of the very population it sought to diminish. Reflection. The reflection on the aftermath of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, Fura, brings forth a critical evaluation of the United States' approach to immigration enforcement. While Fura aimed to redefine immigration policies and act as a deterrent to undocumented immigration, its implementation and subsequent impact revealed significant flaws in the belief that stricter enforcement alone could effectively address the complex challenges associated with immigration. The legacy of Fura serves as a poignant lesson in the limitations of relying solely on punitive measures to curb undocumented immigration. The legislation, enacted in 1996 with the intention of reducing the number of undocumented immigrants, introduced stringent enforcement mechanisms, expanded deportable offenses, and imposed the infamous 3- and 10-year bars. However, rather than achieving its goal, Fura had unintended consequences that reshaped the landscape of immigration in the United States. One crucial aspect highlighted by the post-Fura era is the inadequacy of an enforcement-centric approach. The legislation, driven by a desire to deter individuals from entering or staying in the U.S. without proper documentation, failed to consider the intricate reasons and dynamics that drive immigration. The assumption that increasing the severity of consequences would dissuade individuals proved to be overly simplistic and, ultimately, ineffective. The notion that stronger enforcement alone could solve the complex challenges associated with immigration was challenged by the outcomes of Fura. The legislation not only failed to reduce undocumented immigration but, in fact, contributed to its growth. The implementation of harsh penalties, retroactive deportations, and prolonged re-entry bars did not address the root causes of migration or create a sustainable solution to the challenges posed by unauthorized residency. In reflecting on the legacy of Fura, it becomes evident that a comprehensive and nuanced approach is essential in shaping immigration policies. Understanding the multifaceted factors that drive migration, such as economic opportunities, family reunification, and geopolitical circumstances, is crucial for crafting effective and humane immigration laws. The rigid reliance on enforcement measures, as exemplified by Fura, emphasizes the importance of a holistic approach that considers both the legal framework and the socio-economic realities that underpin immigration patterns. The lessons learned from Fura underscore the ongoing need for thoughtful and evidence-based policymaking in the realm of immigration. As perspectives on immigrants shift over time, acknowledging the limitations of past approaches becomes integral to developing strategies that align with the values of fairness, compassion, and pragmatism. Conclusion. Today, Views on immigrants are very different than they were in the 1990s. Most Americans now see them as a strength, not a burden. However, the laws created in 1996 haven't changed, and the outdated standards don't align with the needs of our nation or immigrant populations. Building higher walls and increasing enforcement isn't the simple solution we learned from 1996.